Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we are going to take a journey through history and the intersection with myth. And in some cases, in America and elsewhere around the world, myth can become the learned history. And that could be good in some ways, and that it could bring people together. But it also could be dangerous in that it spreads falsehoods about heritage and about a country's history. And I would like to talk about that using the movie Gone with the Wind, one of the greatest blockbusters out of Hollywood since movies began in the late 19th century. So let us begin our journey. The image many Americans have of the Old South, the South before the Civil War, which began in 1861, is the image of the plantation, of graceful women in beautiful gowns, and of strong, handsome men in uniforms. And of course, the plantation house itself. It was a dreamland. It was a picture of grace, of gratitude, and of wealth. And this is what many Americans across the country, not only in the South, but this is what many Americans grew up with. When my daughter was in the fourth grade, 10 years old, she took a class trip to Charleston, South Carolina, in the Deep South. And on the bus, on the way to Charleston, her teacher showed the class Gone with the Wind, as if this depiction was the accurate depiction of what life was like in the Old South. For that teacher, the myth had become reality, and not only for her, but for millions of Americans as well. And when myth becomes reality, there are consequences in real life. The myth began in 1861 with the start of the American Civil War. And as you can see here, the states that are outlined and colored in gray represent the Confederate States of America. Here is my state of North Carolina. We were part of the Confederacy that left the Union in 1861 to form their own nation, the Confederate States of America. The states in blue, mainly in the North and far West, were states that remained in the Union and fought for the Union during the American Civil War between 1861 and 1865. Now you will see four red states: Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. These were battleground states. These were states that were neither Southern nor Northern in their sympathies. So there were really three divisions in American society during the Civil War, but the main division was, of course, between North and South. It was a bloody war. 750,000 young men died. If you extrapolate that to today's population, that would have been a casualty rate of 10 million deaths. So you see, it was quite bloody. And a new weapon had appeared on the battlefield during the Civil War. The weapon was the camera, photography. And pictures were sent all around the country to underscore and emphasize the great horrors of war. And here you see a young Confederate soldier, April 1st, 1865, who was killed at the Battle of Fredericksburg. And you multiply that, as I said, by 750,000, and the families they came from, the brothers and sisters, sons and daughters, and mothers and fathers that they left behind. It was, the Civil War was an American tragedy. But when the soldiers came home, the reception was very different. When Northern soldiers came home, and you can see here a portrait of a Northern soldier coming to his home, a very nice home, by the way, with a substantial family. He is wounded, as you could see by his left arm, but nonetheless, he seems to be in good shape. And one of the interesting things about this Northern perspective is that the person you can see in the back of him carrying his duffel bag is a black man. And this is important because one of my themes this evening is that race, and particularly the depictions of the Civil War and race, differed relatively little between North and South after the Civil War. The Southern soldier, on the other hand, came home to devastation. And you can see here the depiction of the destroyed house. Families were scattered in different parts of the South, fleeing the advancing Union Army. In the meantime, in the 2 decades after the Civil War, the 1870s and the 1880s, the American economy transformed. In the North, manufacturing took hold, and with manufacturing came labor problems. There was a great deal of exploitation of American labor, particularly immigrant labor from Eastern and Southern Europe. And here you see a depiction of the Haymarket riot in 1886, which was a conflict between striking workers on the one hand, as you can see on the right of this frame, and police and soldiers on the left trying to prevent a strike. And labor troubles, violent labor troubles, broke out throughout the North. And many Northerners looked south, and the mostly rural agricultural South, everything seemed calm and gentle, and people seemed to get along with each other, not like the broiling industrialization of the North. And soon this juxtaposition, this contrast between the turmoil in the North with lots of immigrants, labor problems, and the calm and beauty of the South. And here is a painting made in 1883, just a few years before the Haymarket riot, of a scene in Natchez, Mississippi, in the deep South, of workers, black workers, picking cotton, steamboat coming down the Mississippi River. Everything looks calm, looks placid. What a difference from the violence of the North. In order to commemorate the Confederacy, many southern states and cities and towns, small towns, began to erect statues. The saying in America goes that the losers remember, the winners move on. And the Confederacy lost, but they insisted on memorializing that loss. These men were heroes against insurmountable odds. And it was true, it was quite amazing that the Confederate States of America lasted for 4 years, despite the disparity between the Confederate States, particularly military disparity between the Confederate States and the Union. And one of the first monuments to be erected was a monument to the Confederate soldier erected in 1879 on the State House grounds in Columbia, South Carolina, the capital of South Carolina, the first state to secede from the Union in 1860. And here you see behind the Confederate battle flag. But it was not only the South, and this is an important point to keep in mind. It was not only the South that began to remember the Civil War in this way. Soon, Northerners, because of this difference between dirty industrialization and all those immigrants coming in contrast with the placid South, where everyone seemed to get along. And this view found its way into textbooks. Now, textbook publishers were very conscious that Northerners and Southerners may have had different views of the Civil War, but they wanted to sell their books nationally. So many of them adopted the Southern point of view because, as I said earlier, Southerners remembered, Northerners moved on. So they didn't really care. And here we have a depiction in a textbook that was popular around 1900 for all school children across the nation of Sunday afternoon on a Southern plantation. And you see the mistress of the plantation reading a book because, of course, slaves could not read. And you see the slaves gathered around her. Again, this placid scene, the scene of contentment, the scene of everybody getting along, and how that contrasted with the present situation in the North and South. The reality, of course, was much different. While the nation was imbibing this myth of a placid South, the reality of the South was far from placid, particularly in the 1890s, when lynching of blacks who had dared to demand equality became a community event. And you can see in the lower portion of this photograph, it was a community event. Um, the entire community often showed up for these lynching bees. But again, and I'm going to stress this throughout the program, this really was a national perception. And in fact, many of the large corporations adopted Southern themes. So, for example, Aunt Jemima Pancakes, which was a Northern company. This was the box in which the pancake mix came in. And you can see here a slave. Aunt Jemima was her name. And she's saying, Lawsy, folks show cheer for fluffy, energizing Aunt Jemima pancakes. Now, of course, people did not talk that way, but the idea was to exaggerate the accents of Black people, to exaggerate their ignorance. This I grew up eating cream of wheat for breakfast, and it's still around. And this was the box of cream of wheat in the early 20th century. Cream of wheat manufactured up north, but had this fellow Rastus. And what he says here, maybe cream of wheat ain't got no vitamins. I don't know what them things is. If they's bugs, they ain't none in cream of wheat, but she's sure good to eat and cheap. Costs about 1 cent for a great big dish. Again, caricature. These Black people are not real. They are figments of white imagination, not only in the South, but nationally as well. In 1896, Thomas Edison, the great inventor of the light bulb and the phonograph and uh, various other American inventions, decided to go into the movies. Um, People in France and Germany had already tinkered with motion pictures, but Thomas Edison wanted to perfect it. So in 1896, he decided that he was going to make a film, the first film in America. And it was 3 minutes long. And what did he decide to do to draw people into the theater to see this 3 minute film? He decided that he would use Black people as their caricature. The name of this film was Eating Watermelons. And the idea was that Black people eat watermelons. And here you can see a still photograph from that film. But the film soon grew into a big entertainment business. That was 1896. Now, in 1915, D.W. Griffith presented The Birth of a Nation. Still silent films, but unlike the 3 minute Thomas Edison film, The Birth of a Nation was 3 hours. And it was a national sensation. This particular poster I got from Seattle, Washington, way out in the Pacific Northwest. So it was a national phenomenon. And it told the story of the American Civil War, and particularly of the era which followed, called Reconstruction. And by that time, many Americans, regardless of where they lived, believed that the Reconstruction era was a mistake, was a dictatorship fostered and foisted on the South, particularly the white South, and particularly because of the liberation of 4 million Blacks that created, so the myth went, an unsafe environment for whites. And the penultimate, the climax of the movie focused on young Mae Marsh, 15 years old. She was picking vegetables and fruit, cherries in the woods. And suddenly, you can see the outline here, a black man stalked her. And she saw that, and she started to run. And one of the brilliant things of D.W. Griffith was that he used the camera. He moved the camera. Before Griffith, many of the movies had a stationary camera, and all of the action went on right there in front of the camera. But Griffith moved the projector back, and you saw Mae Marsh running up a hill. She was running up a hill. And of course, she couldn't see what was at the end of that hill, but the audience did. And what the audience saw was a drop. If she had continued to run, she would have fallen off the mountain and certainly been killed. However, if she stopped before she fell off the mountain, she would have been ravished by this black man. What did she do? Well, I'm not going to tell you. You're going to have to see the movie yourself, but you can probably figure out what happened. She would not give up her virtue. Well, the heroes of this movie were the Ku Klux Klan, and you can see, obviously, in this still, that they captured Gus, this fiend who caused the death of this young white teenage girl he was about to ravish. One interesting thing I want to point out to you about Gus. Gus doesn't really look like a black man, does he? In fact, he was not a black man. In the movie, he was, but in real life, he was a white man. Almost all of the black actors in D.W. Griffith's film Birth of a Nation were white who put on blackface because Griffith was concerned that showing real black people on the screen, especially real black men chasing after white women, would cause riots, especially in the South. So the black people portrayed in Birth of a Nation were actually white. And of course, what happened to Gus, and I can tell you that audiences cheered when the Ku Klux Klan killed Gus, cheered regardless of where they were in the South or the North or the West. Now, let's move this forward to 1947 and Boston. Boston's way up in New England, way up north. Well, Birth of a Nation kept on playing for 40, 50, 60 years after it premiered in 1915, even though it was a silent movie. And of course, by 1947, all the movies were with sound. But this movie was so popular, it kept on being shown across the country. And here you see pickets, mostly black pickets, saying Birth of a Nation revives KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, the white terrorist organization. Even as late as 1947, and even way up in Boston, it was still a popular movie. Now, going back to the time when Birth of a Nation was first popular, it was very open for the Klan to parade. And the Ku Klux Klan paraded right down Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C. in 1928. It was very common to see this sign. This is a laundry company. We wash for white people only. This was the height of segregation, of racial segregation. So the entertainment industry reinforced racial discrimination, racial segregation. And then finally, in 1939, came the biggest blockbuster of all time. To this day, on January 25th, 2023, more people have seen Gone with the Wind than any other movie in history. Gone with the Wind was based on a book by Margaret Mitchell. She was an author located in Atlanta, Georgia, of course, in the South. And she had been researching this book for about 10 years before it was published in 1936. She had used the latest historical research, and historians, professional historians, had bought into this myth of the Old South, this myth of Black misrule and violence in Reconstruction. So when she did her research for the book, she really had few alternate perspectives on Southern history, on the history of the Civil War, on the history of Reconstruction. Now, as many of you know, when books get translated into Hollywood movies, sometimes things are lost. It's not an exact translation. And this was the case with Gone with the Wind. If you read the book, and I urge you to do that, if you read the book Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, the racial ideas are much more sophisticated, much more questioning than the movie. In the movie, it's literally black or white, although it was a movie in Technicolor. By the way, one of the first movies ever made in Technicolor. So the interesting thing was that Margaret Mitchell was not particularly happy with the movie. She was happy with the funds that she got from the movie, but she felt that the movie left certain things out, was not subtle, and Hollywood and subtlety probably don't mix very well. So one of the things she did, she took some of the proceeds that she got from the movie and invested it in Spelman College in Atlanta. Spelman College is an all-Black university for women in Atlanta, Georgia, where Margaret Mitchell lived. And when she died in 1947, she left quite a bit of money to Spelman College, in addition to the scholarships that she had sponsored. So I think it's important to separate, to some degree, Margaret Mitchell from the movie Gone with the Wind. And here you see Scarlett O'Hara. And this is important, and Margaret Mitchell wanted to make this point. Scarlett O'Hara's father was an Irish immigrant. And up north, Irish immigrants were being discriminated against, were being barred from jobs, were ridiculed, were patronized. But in the South, immigrants fared better, mainly because they were white, but nevertheless, they fared better. And this plantation and this wealth was owned by Scarlett's father, Gerald O'Hara, who was an Irish immigrant. So Margaret Mitchell wanted to make a point about how the North treated its immigrants, particularly Catholic immigrants, and how the South treated immigrants. And to top it off, Vivian Leigh, who played Scarlett O'Hara, was not a Southerner. She was not a Northerner. She was from Great Britain. And of course, the public embraced her. And naturally, if you're going to do a plantation movie, you have to have black actors and actresses. And one of the actresses was Hattie McDaniel, whom you see here, became the first black person ever to win an Oscar, Academy Award, which is the highest honor that actors and actresses in movies can obtain in the United States. But still, she's stereotyped here, obviously, uh, as a slave. Now, again, the reality of what was going on in the South, not only in the 1930s, but through the 1960s, here in, in Birmingham, Alabama, when the police put dogs on demonstrators, on black, mostly black demonstrators. And here in Selma, Alabama, when blacks were marching for voting rights, and the state police beat them for protesting peacefully. But this story, unlike some of the stories we've talked about, this story has a happy, not ending, but a happier path forward. Because what happened as a result of the civil rights movement, and particularly in educational fields, people began to understand that, hey, there's something wrong here, there's something missing. Black people are not stereotypes, they're real people, like white people, in fact. And their history needs to be written, needs to be demonstrated, needs to be shown to the public, just like white history is. Because black people in America have a history too. And so what we began to see in the 1990s and continuing to the present day is a representation of black history, not as a separate part of American history where you can talk about it and then forget about and then go back to the real stuff, but rather as an integral and extremely important part of American history. And one of the leaders in this movement to tell that story was Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson, who, of course, was a slaveholder, authored the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And when I first went to Monticello, which was back in the late 1980s, you never heard the word slavery. You never heard the word slave. Everyone was servants. Servants. That's different now. Now, if you go to Monticello in Virginia, Charlottesville, Virginia, you will see that slaves also had a life. You will see their houses. You will see the work they did. You will see where they lived. Jackson, Mississippi, in the deep South, there was no more segregated state in America than Mississippi. Now they have opened a civil rights museum to tell the story of Black Mississippians, not only white Mississippi, because if you had gone to school prior to the year 2000 in Mississippi, basically that's what you'd learn. But since 2018, there is now a civil rights museum in Jackson, Mississippi. But of course, there's a backlash. Well, if you're going to tell the story of Black Southerners, we're going to continue to push the story of white Southerners. And this bust of Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was not only a Confederate general, but he was the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, is in Alabama. And of course, we see the Confederate battle flags here in more recent times, 2017, in the march of Nazis and neo-Confederates in Charlottesville, Virginia. And it generated counter demonstrations, and unfortunately, this vehicle, ran over a young woman and killed her. And statues. If you go throughout the South, you will find statues of Confederate heroes, none more so than on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia. Richmond was the capital of the Confederate States of America. And in order to get our history straight, not only the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction, but the history of America generally, we have to come to terms. Why were these men deified like this in bronze, and why we see no evidence of a Black history in many parts of our country? So beginning in 2019 and particularly 2020, these statues that lined Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, came down. Today, 2023, there is only one statue left on Monument Avenue. It is the statue of Arthur Ashe, the great Black tennis star who was born and grew up in Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. Now, when the Ashe statue was first put there a number of years ago, the idea was, well, we're going to integrate Monument Avenue. You have a lot of those white Confederate generals who fought to preserve the institution of slavery, but now we're going to have a Black man there. And the irony, and perhaps the justice of it, is that the only statue that remains on Monument Avenue is a statue of a Black man. Now, other communities have begun to demonstrate an awareness that Black Americans also had a history apart from the stereotype, apart from the myth that we have seen in the literature and in popular culture, and that they too should be memorialized. So, on the University of Texas campus, right next to a monument commemorating the Confederate States of America, because of course Texas was part of the Confederate States of America, there is a statue of Martin Luther King Jr. So if you can't tear down a monument, the next best thing is to build up a new one to demonstrate that millions of citizens of color also had a history, also contributed to the enterprise that we call America. And ultimately, and some of you have seen this slide before, but it's one of my favorite slides. I'll show it anywhere, anytime. But the objective of challenging myth is to create a history that focuses on the truth, but more important, that provides a path toward a better future. And here you see a daycare in Houston, Texas, and you can see all colors, all nationalities. And this is the future not only of my native South, but hopefully of America as well. Thank you all very much. I will be happy to take questions. Great question. Is there any big difference between the southern and northern states today? Yeah, I can tell you the weather is better here in the south. We don't have to worry about snow and ice to a great deal. But seriously, the distinctions in America today are differences between between cities and small towns and farms. Here in North Carolina, the difference is between cities like Charlotte, where I am, Greensboro, Durham, Raleigh, Chapel Hill, and the North Carolina countryside. That's where the distinctions are. The distinctions are not so much sectional, that is north versus south, as urban versus rural and small town. Any other questions? Is there a cleavage in politics along this line? Yes, absolutely. Just to give you an example from my county here, Mecklenburg County, named after Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern in Germany. In the 2022 midterm elections, Mecklenburg County voted for Democrats 69%. That's quite a large percentage. And Republicans were 31%. So 69 and 31, that's a pretty big margin of, uh, of difference. And if you look at other cities in North Carolina, like Greensboro, and particularly what we call the Research Triangle area, Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, uh, there are similar numbers. Whereas out in the smaller counties, I mean smaller by population, you will find the reverse. You will find strong majorities for the Republican Party. The Republican Party is the party of small towns and farms. The Democratic Party is the party of cities, particularly large cities. How is the image of the Civil War created in modern movies? is this time period romanticized? We've gotten away from that, thankfully. Hollywood has certainly learned its lesson. Uh, we don't do too many movies about the Civil War and Reconstruction anymore. It's still a very contentious issue, and Hollywood wants to sell movie tickets, so they don't do that much anymore. Hollywood prefers to use films and uh, diversity of cast, diversity of directors and producers, and we're coming up to the Academy Award presentations next month, and we can see today or yesterday that the Academy um, had a had its nominations broadcast, and you can see the diversity, but not much to do concerning the Civil War and Reconstruction. That's still a difficult topic. I can tell you, the state of Alabama, every student in the eighth grade has to take a U.S. history course, and in Alabama, the U.S. history they teach begins in 1877, after the Civil War, after uh, Reconstruction. So it's still a sensitive issue. So what you will find in Hollywood certainly are treatments of race, but not necessarily of race during the Civil War. We've had some good movies um, on black troops in the Civil War. The movie Glory, for example. But generally speaking, Hollywood has moved away from these historical biographies and pictures. What do I think about the criticism of the existence of some monuments, such as calls to dismantle the monument to General Lee? Well, the monument to General Lee is gone. And not only in Richmond, which was the capital of the Confederacy, but they're removing generally from other places in the South. They're not necessarily destroying these monuments. They're putting them in a place where they should be, a museum. If you go to the Deutsches Historisches Museum in Berlin, Germany, you will see lots of Nazi paraphernalia there. And that's where it should be. We need to have this story told, because if you bury history, it will come back to hurt you. We need to know about things that are unpleasant, things that make people uncomfortable. But we need to know that in its proper context. And the proper place for these Confederate artifacts are not out in the public, particularly to the exclusion of other groups in Southern and American society, but rather in a museum setting where they can be explained, where they can be contextualized. Which figure in America's Black history is most deserving of a monument? Well, uh, I I mean, that's difficult to say. If I had to pick two, I would certainly pick Martin Luther King Jr. and Frederick Douglass, as well as Ella Baker, who probably did more than any other person to promote the civil rights movement, but she doesn't get enough credit primarily because she's a woman. Uh, so there are many candidates for Black monuments. One of the most interesting things that I've seen in my lifetime occurred during the Olympic Games in Atlanta, Georgia in 1996. Now, of course, this is over 25, 26 years ago. But as many of you know, every Olympic Games has a concluding ceremony. And the concluding ceremony for the 1996 Olympics took place outside of Atlanta in a suburb called Stone Mountain. And there actually is a stone mountain there. And on this stone mountain is displayed a carving, a sculpture of three Confederate generals, Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, uh, and Thomas Stonewall Jackson. It wasn't completed. The sculpture wasn't completed because the sponsors ran out of money in the 1930s. And I'm thinking to myself as I see this, why in the world the Olympic Games, which promotes cooperation and humanity among all the nations of the world, why would they choose Stone Mountain and this particular sculpture as the focus of the closing ceremony? And soon it became evident because while the orchestra was playing Beethoven's Ode to Joy from his Ninth Symphony, they superimposed on that sculpture, they superimposed a hologram of Martin Luther King Jr. That was so dramatic and so perfect to bring us up to that present time, away from the myth of the dark past. What are your thoughts on slavery reparations? I've heard that the government is thinking of paying $5 million to each Black person in San Francisco. Is that true? Well, and not the federal government, I can tell you that. You've raised really a very tough question, a very difficult question, because two-thirds of the American population, of the American white population, was not here in America during the era of slavery. My ancestors did not come from Russia until 1905 and 1923. And by then, there was no slavery. So, why should I pay reparations for something that my ancestors had absolutely nothing to do with? I mean, if Russia wants to compensate the serfs, okay, then maybe I'm on the hook for something. But if America wants to compensate slaves, why take it out of my bank account? And the counter argument to that is that we're all Americans now, regardless of where we came from, regardless of when we came, and to hold people in bondage for over 200 years, and then in a system really resembling apartheid, racial segregation, for another 100 years after that, demands some compensation, demands some reparations. The difficulty, and I agree with that particular perspective, but I understand the difficulty behind it. The difficulty is that Blacks today, like many white Americans, are really mixtures of races. So if somebody is 50% Black, do you give that family 50% of what they would have received had they been 100% Black? In other words, this becomes really a mathematical conundrum. My preference, instead of outright reparations. My preference is to continue the affirmative action plans that we have to benefit Black people trying to get into universities, to benefit Black people trying to hold remunerative jobs, to benefit Black people trying to move into better neighborhoods. That would be a much better policy than giving money and have to figure out what percentages you might get, and that would generate a tremendous amount of resentment in the white community. So reparations, yeah, I agree with reparations, but these reparations have to be policies and not necessarily direct payments. Uh, could you tell us a little about Irish immigrants? Were they treated worse in the North than in the South? Yes. If you were walking around New York City in, say, the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, up until the beginning of the 20th century, you would frequently see in shops in New York, not only New York, but Boston, Philadelphia, um, you would see a sign which said, "No dogs or Irish allowed." If you were seeking people to hire, you would have a sign. You'd see a sign, "No Irish need apply." The prejudice against Irish was significant, particularly in the 19th century. It was also significant because the Irish were Roman Catholic, and this was in the 19th century and through much of the 20th century an overwhelmingly Protestant nation. I saw a headline from a newspaper in Philadelphia in 1855, the Philadelphia Inquirer, which, by the way, is still the main paper in Philadelphia. And the headline said, "Catholics must be exterminated." Can you imagine a headline like that today? That's how many Americans felt about Roman Catholics, particularly Irish Roman Catholics. In the South, it was different. The dividing line in the South was black-white, not Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, not Irish, English, French. So you would find, like Governor Henry Wise of Virginia, saying, "We can't understand all this prejudice against Catholics, all this prejudice against Jewish people. We can't understand that in the South." Uh, they could understand prejudice against Black people, but they couldn't understand prejudice against white people, regardless of their religious affiliations. Take, for example, the city of Charleston, South Carolina, the city that really led the march outside of the Union to the Confederate States of America. Charleston was the most diverse city in America at the time of the Civil War. It had all different ethnic groups. It had all different religious groups, and they all got along. The divide was racial. It wasn't religious. It was not ethnic. Now, give you another example. Mexican War, 1846. The Mexican government put out a decree saying, if you are Catholic and fighting against Mexico, remember that Americans don't like you. Americans are prejudiced against you. Americans will never give you a chance. Come fight for Mexico. And 2,000 Irish Catholic soldiers left the US Army to form the San Patricio Battalion in Mexico to fight against the US in the Mexican War. So this will give you some example of the religious distinctions in America, particularly with respect to the Irish. Okay, final question. What do I think about Black quotas in Hollywood? Maybe there are some results. Are there more films with Black actors? Yeah, I think I don't know if I would call it a quota so much as enlightenment. That realizing that, look, this is our history. We've got to change it. We've got to put on the screen and behind the screen uh, people who look like America and reflect the diversity uh, of America. So I think that that is happening. Some people uh, believe it's not happening fast enough, but Hollywood, as a big corporation, moves very slowly. And I think you will see in the films nominated this year for the Academy Award, I think you will see this type of diversity, and it will persist going forward. I want to thank you all very much for your questions and for your attention. I really enjoyed being with you this evening and look forward to our future conversations.